Javon Hilson is not just a five-star flip for Missouri. His addition also makes this early signing period a net positive for the Tigers, and I'll explain why right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso, and a man who owes his YouTube viewers an apology. Sorry for messing up the video on yesterday's program. Seems like that's something I do about every 6 months or so. So I think I was due. My apologies once again. But on today's program, another quarterback on the market that Missouri fans are very familiar with. Also, Kansas took its first loss in basketball yesterday. Normally, that'd be something to celebrate, but I'm not so sure in this particular case. But before I start the show, I do want to remind you, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And Javion Hilson committed to Missouri yesterday at basically the 11th hour, not literally here in terms of the early signing period, but generally speaking, well, Missouri, there weren't a lot of surprises. To give you an idea of how quickly normally these names come through the, well, what used to be a literal fax machine, more of a figurative fax machine these days. All 16 guys who were expected to sign with Missouri did. Of course, you'll remember that Javion Morrow, a running back, and also Lamont Rogers as well, a big-time offensive line prospect from the state of Texas. Well, they had both flipped elsewhere. Well, Missouri, fortunately, had landed a couple other guys as well, another running back in Marquise Davis, and also more of a speedster-type slot receiver in Demarion Folks. But unfortunately, I have to say, while you could definitely talk yourself into Marquise Davis and Jamarion Morrow being about a wash, both very talented running backs, four-star plus type players, it's hard to argue that, no offense to Demarion Folks, who may well end up being the better player than Lamont Rogers. That's certainly on the table. But at the moment, it's hard to take a potentially as much as a five-star offensive lineman prospect over a 5'10" receiver. Again, no disrespect to Folks whatsoever, but if you're an NBA fan, at a certain point, that's like comparing a great 6'1" point guard to a great 7-foot center who can do it all. One of those things is just simply more valuable than the other. But getting back to Javon Hilson, you add him into the equation, and all of a sudden what was looking like a net loss here in this early signing period for Missouri leading up to it has now become a net win to me, because Hilson, well, according to Rivals at least, is a five-star recruit in his own right. According to On3, he's the 49th best player in the country, the fourth best edge rusher, and yes, from Cocoa, Florida. That's an area that Missouri has really been starting to get into lately. So it's nice to land a really big fish from the ocean there over in Cocoa. So the thing is, this is a really interesting land for Missouri, because Hilson was a guy whose name I had seen brought up. It's not the first time I had heard his name, but there was no moment in following his recruiting where I thought, oh yeah, Missouri's definitely going to land this guy. In fact, quite the opposite. The Tigers didn't really even come in with an offer until November, got him on campus for an official visit for the final weekend of the dead period. So about as late as you could possibly get a guy, certainly on campus, but just to start the recruiting process in general. It's quite an impressive flip, and also speaks to not only Eli Drinkwitz and his staff's recruiting process, but again, something I brought up a lot, Missouri's NIL infrastructure, which is not only strong, but seems to be pretty upfront and honest. They tend to make their payments. I haven't heard any rumors or innuendo about, well, Missouri promised this, but they didn't deliver. seems like they deliver, and then maybe then some. If you're Luther Burden and you like some potato chips on the market as well, that type of deal. But back to Hilson, just to give you an idea of what type of player he is. Once again, he was originally committed to Alabama, but then backed off of that pledge quite a while ago when Nick Saban decided to retire about a year ago this time, and then gave a verbal commitment to Florida State. Well, then Florida State obviously started off terribly, finished the season 2-10. He backed off of that commitment in October, and, well, now ultimately ends up at Missouri. So some unusual circumstances there. Not unusual, I should say really understandable circumstances where Hilson would flip, by the way. Speaking of another guy from Cocoa, well, Javon Boggs, a receiver who was committed to Missouri at one point, well, he's now on his fourth commitment, by the way. He went from Ohio State to Missouri to UCF, and speaking of the Seminoles, he is now with Florida State officially as a commitment. 4 different spots in one process is really impressive and might be a record of some sort. But in the case of Hilson, again, he was committed to Alabama. Nick Saban retires. Okay, a lot of guys understandably decide to go elsewhere, open up their commitment when the head coach retires or their main position coach moves to another opportunity. That's completely understandable. And obviously, well, Florida State 2-10. Normally records year to year don't have that much of an impact on these high school recruits. But it's one thing. It's one thing when you lose a few more games, going from what Florida State won 12-13 last year to 2 this season. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that will definitely catch anybody's attention. So obviously, bottom line is, I think when Lamont Rogers had decommitted, when Jamarian Morrow had decommitted, fortunately Missouri, again, flipped another couple 4-star guys, but it sure seemed like a net loss to me, unfortunately, at least on paper. But now with Hilson, you add in a big-time edge rusher to the mix, a guy who's 5-star, top 50. I think that's got to be considered a win for the Tigers, at least in this short little early signing period. Now, one thing, if you follow recruiting on X these days, some of the more interesting guys to follow are actually guys who are solidly committed to Missouri before the early signing day period, that type of deal. Guys like Jack Lang, guys like Matt Zollers, the offensive tackle and quarterback, respectively. Well, both of them seem to be putting out the idea that, hey, there's another guy who might be out there, just wait. And maybe it was Javon Hilson, but it may also have been Jeremiah Jones, the tight end as well, who did end up committing to Nebraska. Or did he? Because now there's some question marks out there about whether maybe Missouri will come up with a better offer. Well, again, if you read the tea leaves here, it seemed like Missouri came in with maybe a last-second offer that was then came up over the top by Nebraska. So I don't know. Who knows? I got to guess it's going to be the Huskers at this point. Jones at tight end seems like somebody they really want. But interestingly enough, Jeremiah Jones definitely seems to be one of those guys who is playing the NIL game for sure. And it's definitely hard to fault anyone for that. If you're an 18-year-old, this is a rare opportunity to cash in. And another quarterback has hit the portal market that Missouri fans are quite familiar with. And he has a different profile than I would say either Miller Moss or Connor Weigman. So let's talk about that young man and also a little bit more on Moss, Weigman, the whole quarterback market, all kinds of stuff to get to here on the program. But first, let's talk about FanDuel, because you got to get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your live bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. I got to say, the most intriguing line, I think, of championship weekend for me in terms of value, I just have a feeling Oregon is going to take care of Penn State. Maybe I'm wrong, but I will give the 3.5 with the Ducks against the Nittany Lions. Regardless of what you're into, though, you got to visit FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. According to Max Olson of ESPN, Oklahoma starting quarterback Jackson Arnold is going to be entering the transfer portal. He has an impressive profile, a former 4-star recruit. Threw for 1,800 yards, 15 touchdowns over 10 games. He'll have 2 seasons left of eligibility, and at least in Olson's opinion, he says will be one of the top quarterbacks on the transfer market. And if you're feeling a little bit cold about the potential of Jackson Arnold being a Missouri quarterback, well, I'd probably be right there with you. If you saw the Missouri game against Oklahoma, of course, not only was Arnold just 15 of 24 for 74 yards passing in that ball game. No touchdowns, no picks, but some truly devastating fumbles. Obviously, the Zion Young scoop and score in particular was quite the coup de grace there for Missouri at the end of the ball game, and really just a horrible mistake by Arnold on a lot of different levels as well. He's definitely a good runner, which gives him something unique, different than Miller Moss and Connor Weigman. That's for sure. The two guys who I talked about mostly yesterday. And really at this point, I don't think there's any indication that Missouri is really interested in Jackson Arnold. Whether they are or not, we'll just have to see here in the coming days, more than likely. But I'm with all the people who would be a little bit cold on Arnold, though he's definitely a better runner than Miller Moss and Connor Weigman. And when I put out the hypothetical question yesterday, who would you rather have, the former USC quarterback in Miller Moss or the former Texas A&M quarterback in Connor Weigman, had a lot of people say that neither guy was mobile enough for them. They would prefer a dual threat type of quarterback. And others simply said neither. I don't want either one of them. And fair enough to some extent, but honestly, that wasn't the question that was asked. I specifically said, if you have to choose one of these two, who would you pick? And I do think that's an important exercise to have, even if your opinion is, hey, I'd rather have Jackson Arnold maybe than those two guys. That would be a more acceptable answer to me than just saying neither. Because in reality, you're gonna have to pick somebody. Missouri is going to have to pick somebody in this market. Who are the best guys in this market? We can debate that, but the point is the very best starters in the country who are going to be returning next season in some of the best programs, well, they're not going to be available. Had Jackson Arnold, for example, had Miller Moss, had Connor Weigman, if they had all started every single game and everything went well, or they were all SEC, all conference type of players, then they'd probably be staying in their current spots. So the reality is, more often than not, I'd say 9 out of 10 times, these quarterbacks are going to have questions. Even Jaden Daniels, who won the Heisman Trophy a couple seasons ago, who Missouri very nearly got 2 or 3 seasons ago in the offseason. Well, he had his questions coming out of Arizona State as well. A lot of his teammates famously weren't a huge fan when a video leaked in the locker room. They were basically saying he was mid, that type of thing. Well, the bottom line is, whether those guys were wrong or not, certainly Jaden Daniels feels like he proved them wrong. I think he improved tremendously in those 2 years. Regardless, the point is, it's not as though the perfect quarterback is out there. Patrick Mahomes and Chase Daniel at 22 years old are not walking through that door. So we're going to have to find the best option of the options that are available. That's why, to me, at least the thought experiment of, hey, who would you pick between those two guys? Well, you can say neither. I want somebody better. That may not be a realistic option for Eli Drinkwitz. I've also had a lot of people the last couple days say, hey, what about Sam Horn? Why so much portal quarterback talk? Why are we not developing our own players, that type of deal. And I even had one listener who said, I would rather Missouri develop a quarterback. Portal quarterbacks would put the program into a cycle of having to find someone every year. As I'm thinking about it, what happened to Sam Horn? Well, what happened to Sam Horn is he tore his UCL. He had Tommy John surgery playing baseball for the Tigers. And really, and this is his second significant elbow injury while playing baseball. And the reality is, if Sam Horn came out right now and said, you know what, I'm done with baseball, I'm just concentrating on football from here on out, I would be a lot more bullish on Horn, because that football motion, throwing it, doesn't really put that elbow into jeopardy. That's one thing. You're not throwing curveballs and snapping that elbow with as much force and velocity as you possibly can with a much lighter ball, by the way, too. That may be a part of that whole action, too, although I'm not a sports medicine guy. I will admit that. But I do understand that the actual physical motion of throwing a baseball, especially at a high level, and everything that takes is much different than throwing a football. So much more stress on the elbow. But the reality is Horn is not going to stop playing baseball. And he shouldn't, by the way. He's got all the chances in the world with the talent that he has to throw a baseball 97, 98 miles an hour or whatever it is. Those guys don't just grow on trees. So he's going to get all the opportunities he can to play professional baseball. And if I were him, I would keep those options open. The problem is, now you're looking at a guy who's been in the program for a while now, but has seen very little action, has been injury prone. How do you count on him? That's the thing with Horn. That's why if you're Missouri, even if you still like Horn, maybe you still like his talent a lot. You like the kid, you like the athlete, all that stuff. That's fine. I'm not being dismissive of Horn or the idea that he could start for Missouri next season. But once again, how could you possibly count on that after what you've seen in 3 seasons here with Horn already on the roster? And coming up, I want to take more of your questions from the listeners, the commenters, all that good stuff, including from the ultimate unicorn, a Locked On Mizzou female listener. Yes, they do exist, ladies and gentlemen. Also, there's this idea out there by some Missouri fans that Luther Burden was slightly overrated during his time at Missouri. I want to smash this argument once and for all. Coming up right after these quick words. So listener Lynn Redman wrote in, and I assume Lynn is a female, and now as I'm reading this, I'm going, you know what? She could totally be a man, baby, in this particular case. There are guys who are named Lynn as well. Oh, what the heck? Lynn, that's got to be a lady. So we're going to go with it, ma'am. John, forget the percentages. Brady deserved the touchdown last game at Faroe. Always take the points you're given. Well, once again, Lynn, thanks for being in the 4% of female listeners on this program. But number 2, I totally agree that Brady deserved the touchdown, and I'm not being mad or critical at all. Just trying to logically think through all of this. And you can't just logically then say, hey, throw out the percentages, that type of deal. But to be fair, I will say there is no actual correct or right answer in any of these types of exercises, because quite simply, none of us can predict the future. There's a lot of assumptions being made here in any of these types of things. But I tell you, the past is also a really great guide too. And if you look at even Blake Craig's percentages from 30 yards on in, well, that's a lot better than Missouri's percentages of scoring a touchdown in the red zone. That was really my only point there. And again, don't care. Glad Brady got the touchdown. Everything worked out how it was supposed to. No hard feelings here whatsoever. Just an intellectual exercise that I just wanted to go through. But here's another thing that I would just like to destroy intellectually here at the moment. Listener Scott says, I want to ask your opinion on a discussion I had with some other Missouri fans. I'm hoping these Missouri fans were disagreeing with you, Scott. I hate to say it, but now that Burden's playing days are over, did he underperform compared to the hype surrounding him? I say yes. Outside of a few games, he was more of a tease than anything. He disappeared way too much for his talent level, combined with the dumb penalties. He left a lot on the table to be desired. Wow. Well, again, you got to remember, Luther Burden III came here as a true freshman in 2022 and got nearly 500 yards receiving, something like that, scored a bunch of touchdowns. Compare that to what most true freshmen do. And I would argue that Missouri was playing him out of position all season as an outside receiver. And you saw in 2023, Burden moves inside to the slot, and suddenly he takes off, gets well over 1,000 yards receiving. And really more to the point, because while obviously Burden's fantasy numbers, his total yards, touchdowns went down from his sophomore season, I still am just having difficulty naming any player in Missouri football history who had more clutch plays than Luther Burden, especially a non-quarterback, that type of deal, and especially a receiver. I mean, to me, Burden's list of clutch plays, and again, I haven't done an exhaustive list here because there's so many of them. I'm going to leave some out, but to me, the list of plays is unassailable. From the 4th and 17 against Florida that Missouri absolutely had to have, to, of course, the game winner against Ohio State in the Cotton Bowl. My God, the South Carolina catch this season, the one-hander for a touchdown on 4th down. Had that standed, had Missouri gone on to make the playoff, or let your mind run wild with imagination, the point is, that's going to go down as one of the great catches in Missouri history, but through no fault of his own, it's actually going to be, it should have been even better. Had Missouri gotten a stop there, boy, you're really, really talking about something that is remembered forever and ever. Again, through no fault of his own, Luther Burden is not a defensive player. Let's put it that way. And then, of course, an incredible play down the sidelines against Oklahoma. I mean, again, there's just so many moments here. I genuinely forget all of them. I promise you that I do. So, again, just the ones that I've listed off the top of my head. Name another receiver who had that kind of list. Don't get me wrong. I love Chase Kaufman. I love Justin Gage. I love all these different guys. But to me, I just don't think there's anybody who has a list like that. So the idea that Luther Burden underperformed, I mean, if you thought that he was going to be the greatest wide receiver in the history of college football, then yes, he did not reach that lofty of a status. Was he better than Devonta Smith in 2020 in any one of his given seasons? Well, no, he wasn't. But still, I still think Luther Burden, to me, with that list, with how Missouri performed the last 2 seasons, in 2 out of his 3 seasons, hey, I'll give him a pass as true freshman. He didn't just completely raise Missouri up to a 10-win season that year. But I don't know. The Luther Burden legacy, to me, could not be more unassailable. And thanks, as always, for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen today. For your second listen, check out the Locked On SEC podcast. Chris Gordy holding no punches whatsoever, covering the best conference in college football. Find Locked On SEC on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And you know what? I'm looking forward to listening to the squad tonight, because I wasn't on this week's show. Spoiler alert for you there, but it was being recorded during the Cal and Missouri game. So no regrets there. I was happy to see that incredible second half comeback by the Tigers. But check out Locked On SEC. Even when I'm not on it, it's a great show. You'll love it. So until next time, I am John Miller, and this has been Locked On Mizzou.